There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. You know, if you didn't know anything about Christianity, you would say, you Christians are awfully goth. What's with this washed in the blood and being plunged in the fountain of blood and all that goes on? I don't know that I want to hang with you guys, right? I mean, I don't wear enough black mascara to be a Christian, evidently, right? That's because I'm not goth enough. So it sounds really weird, doesn't it? We have these strange imagery that comforts us, that we listen to, that's like, oh, I understand what that means, and that brings comfort to my soul. But really, if you're hearing it for the first time or you're an outsider, it's like, that's just crazy talk. Right? That's just crazy talk. What are you doing? And the image is interesting because, of course, we know it comes from the comfort of a Savior who shed his blood for our sins, cleansed us, and bought us a path to heaven to spend eternity with God. And we understood why that price had to be paid and why that was the only price that could be paid. And without that price, there's nothing you can do to get yourself to heaven. So we understand it that way. But if you're hearing it for the first time, it's a little odd. I was at a dinner last Tuesday night with a bunch of Whitworth professors, and we were up at a restaurant on the north end of town, and I was meeting for the first time the dean of the library, and she was a marvelously interesting, fascinating person. And because of her world in literature and what she goes with, she's meeting an awful lot of Jewish people. And she says, it's very interesting because all my Jewish friends that I'm meeting now in my world, they keep pulling me aside and like whisper or asking, they're saying stuff like, so, say that again, you're telling me the apostles were Jewish, right? The 12 apostles were Jews, right? To which, for those of us who've read the Bible, it's like, of course they were Jews. In fact, many don't even know, you've heard of the Last Supper, right? Well, the Last Supper was a Passover Seder dinner. And that's a very fascinating thing because it connects the sacrifice of Jesus to the Jewish nation, to what had gone on in liberating the Jewish people and making them the chosen ones of God, and Jesus opening the doors to making many the chosen ones of God. We've been studying through the Gospel of Matthew here at the Gathering House, and today we run across the passage where Jesus actually does institute the Last Supper in Matthew. So grab a Bible, and we're going to take a look at what we can learn from it. You will see it in these Bibles. We have it here. The Matthew passage will begin on page 1004, I believe, and it's known as this act of communion. We call it in the Baptist circles or the Protestant circles, the evangelical covenant circles and Presbyterian circles. We call it communion. The Catholics call it the Eucharist. I think Lutherans might also use that term, the Holy Eucharist, that kind of thing. And what is this? That this particular act of worship has survived through the ages. And it doesn't matter whether you're in China or whether you're in Africa, or whether you're in North America or Europe, we all share this one common practice. We may not sing the same songs, we don't build the same institutions, we don't sit in church the same way, celebrate the same way, but we all do this particular act of worship. And over time, I have stumbled across this teaching before in our past, in our history. And I was kind of looking back like, well, when was the last time I taught on this? And it would have been back 2 years ago, 2022, when I actually we were studying through the book of Exodus. And we got to the actual Passover in the book of Exodus. And I think I called that one a meal to remember. And I got slides of how to find these. So if you go to our website, because I'm not going to say everything I said in those I went back and listened, like, oh, there's some good stuff in there. And I'm not going to repeat it for this sermon. I'm going to do some new stuff. But you might want to hear the good stuff I did before. So go to our YouTube or our web page, thegatheringhouse.org, or gatheringhouse.org. There's no the. Click on that green bar. It'll take you to our YouTube channel. And it'll look like this. And then in the search right there, just click in a meal to remember. And poof, this will pop up. And you will get these others. You'll get the sermon, the meal to remember. You will get the one I did in the Gospel of John in 2020 called Eucharist. And way back in Mark, when I did Mark many years ago, 2016, I've got an audio only of that same one. So they're all a little different. They all say slightly different stuff. And you could go back and listen to more if you want to study more. But today, we're going to kind of stay mostly focused in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, let's talk about the Last Supper being a Passover Seder. So for those of you that don't know, Passover was the event that commemorated the Jewish people being liberated from slavery in Egypt. It was actually probably the definitive moment in which they become officially the chosen nation of God. They had been a chosen people through Abraham, but they had spent 430 years in bondage in Egypt, forming themselves as a nation. And God had done that so that they wouldn't scatter and fight each other and go off into tribes and disperse themselves across the land. He'd put them in a situation where they were forced to stay together for 400 years until they had become a nation of people, not just little isolated tribal groups. And when it was time to liberate them, God takes on the most powerful entity on earth at the time, which was the nation of Egypt. And God takes on Egypt, and the Hebrew children, without lifting a finger or fighting at all, sit tight and they watch God fight Egypt. And when I did that sermon series in Exodus, I talked about each of the 10 plagues was actually God kicking the rear of one of the Egyptian gods. And so when you saw all of the 10 plagues, it's like you got to know what Egyptian god this was, whose butt God was kicking. And then you understood, oh, he was showing, I'm the all-powerful God. Everything you worship, everything you believe in, all the powers that you think are on earth dictating your life, I'm the God of it all.
Come on.
Right? That's what he was saying. And so he gets to the very last one, and the very last one was the death of the firstborn. And every animal and every person and every family, the death of the firstborn child would happen. Now, for us, it's like, that's kind of an odd pick, because we kind of mix and match. Do you have a favorite child? No, there's no such thing as a favorite child. Although my daughter Kelsey would argue that. But in their culture, the firstborn was something totally different. Firstborn was the legacy. Firstborn is the one who inherits double the amount of all the other siblings. Firstborn is the one whose job was to keep the family together. The firstborn was the one who would hold all things together so that your family wouldn't fall apart. They had a responsibility that no one else had. So when the firstborn is killed, it's a massive blow to the legacy of a family or a tribe or a clan or a nation. And so God takes out the firstborn of every family, of every person in Egypt, but leaves the Hebrew children alone. Okay, how many of you would be dead? Raise your hand if you'd be dead. All right. How many of you know someone who would be dead? Right? Let's face it. Nobody was exempt from that. You were either dead yourself or you knew someone who would be dead. And it was devastating to the Egyptians, but it sets the Hebrew children free. And the night that God was going to do that execution throughout the land of Egypt, and it had actually been a curse that Pharaoh had called down, because Pharaoh said, well, I'm so fed up after the 9th plague, I'm going to kill the firstborn of all the Hebrew children. And so God says, all right, you've named your own curse. And he just turns it right back on the Egyptians, right? And so what had happened is he told the Hebrew children, here's what you got to do. You have to go sacrifice a lamb. And if there's families too small, join with another family, because you're going to eat this entire lamb tonight. It must be roasted. It can't be boiled. It can't be baked. You're going to roast it over fire. And this lamb's to be eaten with bitter herbs. And that usually meant like a horseradish and salt water and these kind of things. And the bitter herbs would remind you of your suffering, your sorrow, your tears that you have been in bondage for 430 years. And along with that, there was another dish that they would make, and it's made out of apple and dates and cinnamon and some mixed wine and stuff, and it's called haroset. And it was a dish that was set in there. It's almost like a dessert, but that particular dish was to represent the mortar of the bricks that they had been forced to make to build the empire of Egypt. And so they had the roasted lamb. They had other things that they would eat as well. But the haroset, they would have the bitter herbs. Usually it was, today in modern times, it's horseradish and salt. So you eat some horseradish with a cracker and you cry, right? And so there was this meal that was going on, and they had to eat it in haste, dressed in their traveling clothes. Because for 430 years they had cried, God, set us free from slavery. And they're like, God's not listening to us anymore. We've been praying and praying and praying, and God ain't showing up. And so this night, God's like, okay, so I'll tell you how powerful I'm going to show up. You better be dressed and ready to travel by daybreak. That's how fast you're going to leave Egypt. And when you leave, Egypt's going to pay you to go. And they did. They dumped gold and silver and earrings and jewelry and everything on, like, we're paying you to get out after the death of the firstborn. Now, when the angel of death was going to go through the land and seek out which household to take the firstborn out of, there was only one way that you were spared. That one way is to take the blood from the lamb that you had sacrificed, and you painted it on the side posts of your door and over the lintel of your front door. Anyone who was inside the house, when the angel of death went through the city, through the town, and the angel of death saw a house whose doorway was covered by the blood of that lamb, that sacrificial lamb, the angel of death would pass over that house and skip it and move on. That's where the